Gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Calistoga, California, as Garrett Sullivan rode into town, his weathered face betraying nothing of the weariness that had settled deep in his bones after 15 years of drifting across the western frontier. It was 1878, and the promise of gold had faded into memory, leaving behind towns like this one part hopeful, part desperate, clinging to survival in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada. Garrett guided his chestnut mare past the saloon where the commotion originated, noting with practiced indifference the two men engaged in a standoff. Such scenes were common in these parts, and he'd learned long ago that a stranger's quarrels weren't worth dying for. The setting sun cast long shadows across the main street as he made his way to the livery stable, intent on securing lodging for his horse before seeking his own bed for the night. Passing through, asked the stable hand, a boy of no more than 16 with dirt-smudged cheeks and knowing eyes too old for his face. "Always am," Garrett replied, handing over the reins and a silver coin. "Just need a stall for the night." The boy nodded, pocketing the money. "Plenty of room. Ain't many travelers this time of year. Town's quiet except for the usual Saturday night foolishness." Garrett collected his saddlebags and bedroll, slinging them over his shoulder before heading toward the modest hotel across the street. He'd follow his usual routine: a hot meal, perhaps a whiskey, and an early departure at first light. Calistoga would be just another in the long string of places he'd visited and forgotten, towns that blurred together in his memory like watercolors in the rain. The hotel lobby was simple but clean, with faded floral wallpaper and a brass bell on the wooden counter. Garrett rang at once, waiting as footsteps approached from the back room. He was counting out coins from his leather pouch when she appeared, and the sight of her made his fingers still. Katherine Newcomb stood behind the counter, her auburn hair swept into a practical knot at the nape of her neck, though errant strands had escaped to frame her face. Her green eyes met his with a directness uncommon among the women he encountered in his travels. "Welcome to the Calistoga Inn," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "Will you be needing a room?" "Yes, madam," Garrett replied, finding his voice. "Just for tonight." She nodded, turning the guest book toward him. "That'll be 50 cents, including breakfast. Please sign here." As he scrawled his name in the book, she studied him with quiet assessment. He was used to such looks. A stranger in town always warranted observation. But something in her gaze felt different, as though she were reading stories written in the creases of his sun-leathered face. "Room 3, top of the stairs and to your right," she said, sliding a key across the counter. "Supper's being served in the dining room for another hour if you're hungry." Garrett pocketed the key. "Much obliged." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Mr. Sullivan? You look like you've been riding hard. There's fresh coffee in the dining room, too. No charge for guests." It was a small kindness, the kind Garrett had learned not to expect. He nodded his thanks and made his way upstairs, suddenly aware of the trail dust coating his clothes and the stubble shadowing his jaw. Perhaps he would clean up before that coffee after all. The room was modest but comfortable: a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a small window overlooking the main street. Garrett set down his belongings and poured water from the pitcher into the basin, splashing his face and scrubbing away the day's grime. He changed into his cleanest shirt, running fingers through his dark blonde hair in a cursory attempt at grooming. Downstairs, the dining room was mostly empty, save for an elderly couple in the corner and a salesman type studying papers at a table near the window. Garrett took a seat near the back wall, a habit from years of keeping his back protected and his eyes on the door. Katherine appeared with a coffee pot, pouring him a steaming cup without asking. "Kitchen's still open if you'd like supper," she said. "What's on offer?" he asked. "Beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Cook makes the best pie in Northern California, or so the regulars claim." Garrett's stomach rumbled at the mention of home cooking. "Sounds fine," he said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. As she turned to leave, his curiosity got the better of him. "You the proprietor here, Mississippi?" "Mrs. Newcomb," she corrected gently. "And yes, the inn is mine. Has been for 3 years now." He noted the title, but saw no ring on her finger. "A widow, then? You run it alone?" A flicker of something pride, perhaps, or defiance crossed her features. "I do, with help from Mrs. Perkins in the kitchen and Tom for the heavy lifting. But it's my place." She disappeared into the kitchen before he could respond, leaving him with the impression of a woman who had claimed her independence in a world that rarely allowed women such freedom. It was an admirable thing, he thought, sipping the strong coffee. Katherine returned with a tray bearing a bowl of fragrant stew, a thick slice of bread slathered with butter, and a small dish of pickled vegetables. "Enjoy," she said, setting it before him. "I'll check on you in a bit." The stew was hearty and flavorful, chunks of beef and vegetables in a rich broth that spoke of slow cooking and careful seasoning. Garrett ate methodically, savoring each bite as though it might be days before his next proper meal, a habit formed during leaner times. The dining room emptied gradually, until only Garrett remained, using the last of his bread to sop up the remaining broth. Katherine emerged from the kitchen, carrying a plate with a generous slice of apple pie. "You look like you enjoyed the stew," she observed, setting down the dessert. "Thought you might appreciate the pie as well." "Much obliged," he said, surprised by the gesture. "Though I didn't order it." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face, revealing a dimple in her left cheek. "Consider it a welcome to Calistoga. We don't get many strangers this time of year." Against his better judgment, Garrett found himself asking, "Won't you join me? Seems a shame to eat pie alone." Katherine hesitated, glancing around the empty room. "I suppose I could sit for a moment. The dishes can wait." She disappeared briefly, returning with her own slice of pie and a cup of coffee. Taking the seat across from him, she folded her hands on the tablecloth. "So, Mr. Sullivan, what brings you to our little corner of California?" "Just passing through," he replied automatically. "Heading north." "You're always just passing through somewhere, aren't you?" There was no judgment in her tone, only quiet understanding. Garrett looked up, meeting her gaze. "What makes you say that? I've seen your type before. Never unpacking your saddlebags completely. Always keeping an eye on the door." She took a sip of coffee, running to something or away from it. Her directness caught him off guard. Most folks respected the unspoken code of the West. A man's business was his own. "Just how I live," he answered finally. "Never found a reason to stop moving." Katherine nodded, accepting his non-answer. "Well, Calistoga's a pleasant place to pass through. The hot springs draw visitors year-round, though mostly in summer. Some folks say the mineral waters have healing properties." "You believe that?" he asked, sampling the pie. It was indeed exceptional, the apples spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, the crust flaky and buttery. "I believe people find what they need to find," she said thoughtfully. "Some need healing waters, others need." She trailed off, her eyes drifting toward the window where night had fully descended. Other things. There was a story there, Garrett thought, but it wasn't his to ask after. They ate their pie in comfortable silence for a few moments before she spoke again. "Where will you go after Calistoga?" He shrugged. "North, like I said. Maybe Oregon. Heard there's work there." "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Sullivan?" "Garrett," he corrected. "And whatever pays. Ranching mostly. Breaking horses. Driving cattle. Skilled with a gun when needed, though I prefer not to use it." She studied him with those perceptive green eyes. "A man of many talents, then? Jack of all trades, master of none." He replied with a self-deprecating smile. "Sometimes that's more valuable than mastering just one thing," Katherine said. She pushed back her chair, collecting their empty plates. "I should let you rest. You'll be wanting an early start, I imagine." Garrett nodded, suddenly reluctant for the conversation to end. "Thank you for the pie and the company." She smiled again, that transformative expression that made something tighten in his chest. "Good night, Garrett Sullivan. Sleep well." He watched her go, balancing the dishes with practiced ease, her back straight and her steps purposeful. Then he rose, leaving a generous tip on the table before heading upstairs to his room. Lying on the narrow bed, hands folded behind his head, Garrett found himself thinking of Katherine Newcomb's dimpled smile and direct questions. It had been a long time since he'd had a conversation that wasn't transaction-based or superficial. Longer still since he'd felt any inclination to linger in a town beyond the necessary rest for his horse and himself. Yet as he drifted toward sleep, it was not the road ahead that occupied his thoughts, but the widow with knowing eyes who ran the Calistoga Inn. Morning arrived with golden lights streaming through the small window and the distant sounds of a town coming to life. Garrett rose and dressed efficiently, packing his few belongings before heading downstairs. The dining room was busier now, with several tables occupied by travelers and locals enjoying breakfast. Katherine was moving between tables, pouring coffee and exchanging greetings. She spotted him and nodded, gesturing toward an empty table by the window. Garrett took a seat, accepting the coffee she brought moments later. "Sleep well?" she asked. "Better than most places," he admitted. "Good. Breakfast is eggs, bacon, and johnny cakes. That suit you?" "Fine, thank you." As she turned to leave, he surprised himself by asking, "How did you come to own an inn in Calistoga?" Katherine paused, regarding him with slight surprise at his interest. "My husband and I bought it when we came west from Missouri in '73. After he passed, I decided to keep it going rather than return east." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said automatically. Her expression softened. "Thank you. It was hard at first, but the inn keeps me busy, and I've grown to love this town." She brought his breakfast shortly thereafter, and it was as satisfying as the previous night's meal, eggs cooked just right, bacon crisp, and johnny cakes drizzled with honey. Garrett ate steadily, observing the other patrons, and, more often than he cared to admit, watching Katherine move around the room with quiet efficiency. When he'd finished, he approached the counter to settle his bill. Katherine tallied it quickly, accepting his payment. "So you're off north today?" she asked, handing him his change. "That was the plan," he replied, pocketing the coins. She hesitated, then said, "If you're not in a hurry, you might consider staying another day. There's a local rancher looking for help breaking some new stock. Could be worth your while." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "How do you know I'd be interested?" "You mentioned horse breaking last night," she said with a slight smile. "And Ben Thornton pays fair wages for good work. His ranch is just outside town. I could point you in the right direction." He should refuse, Garrett knew. The road was waiting, and he never stayed anywhere long enough to put down even the shallowest of roots. Yet something in her expression, hopeful but not presuming, made him reconsider. "Might be worth looking into," he conceded. "Where would I find this Thornton?" Relief flickered across Katherine's face. "Take the north road about 2 miles. Can't miss it, big white house with red barns. Tell him I sent you." Garrett nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "Much obliged for the recommendation. And for the hospitality." "You're welcome back any time, Mr. Sullivan," she said, and he couldn't help but think she meant it. At the livery stable, Garrett found his mare well rested and eager to move. He saddled her carefully, still debating the wisdom of delaying his departure for potential work. It wasn't like him to alter his plans on someone else's suggestion, particularly a woman he'd just met. Yet Katherine Newcomb's quiet confidence had been persuasive. Decision made, he mounted up and headed north out of town. The morning was clear and mild, the kind of day that made travel pleasant. The road wound through rolling hills dotted with oak trees, their branches spreading wide against the blue sky. Thornton's ranch appeared exactly as Katherine had described, an impressive spread with a stately white house overlooking several well-maintained barns and corrals. A handful of men were working with cattle in a distant pasture, while closer to the main house, someone was exercising a handsome bay stallion. Garrett approached the house, dismounting and tying his mare to a hitching post. A man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades under the California sun. "Help you?" the man called. "Looking for Ben Thornton," Garrett replied. "Katherine Newcomb from the inn in town said he might be hiring." The man's expression brightened at Katherine's name. "I'm Thornton. And if Kate sent you, you must be worth talking to. What's your line?" "Name's Garrett Sullivan. I break horses, drive cattle, handle most ranch work." Thornton assessed him with shrewd eyes. "Got 6 new Mustangs, need gentling. Last fella I hired got thrown and broke his collarbone on the 2nd day. You think you can do better?" "Yes, sir, I can," Garrett said without hesitation. Working with wild horses was dangerous, but it was one skill he genuinely prided himself on. "Pays $3 a day plus meals. Got a bunkhouse for the hands. Job'll last about 2 weeks if you work out." It was fair pay for hard work, and 2 weeks would put some solid money in Garrett's pocket before he continued north. "When do you want me to start?" Thornton grinned. "How about now? Come see what you're getting into." The next few hours were spent assessing the Mustangs, a spirited bunch captured from the hills to the east. They were beautiful animals, with good lines and strong bodies, though untamed and wary of humans. Garrett spent time just observing them, noting their temperaments and hierarchies, while Thornton explained his expectations. By mid-afternoon, Garrett had settled his belongings in the bunkhouse and begun initial work with the Mustangs, establishing his presence in their corral without making demands. It was slow, patient work, the kind that couldn't be rushed without consequences. As the sun began to set, Thornton called him in for supper. The ranch cook, a jovial Mexican man named Miguel, served hearty portions of beef, beans, and biscuits to the half-dozen ranch hands gathered around the long table in the bunkhouse. "So you know Kate Newcomb?" asked one of the hands, a young man with a shock of red hair. "Just met her yesterday," Garrett replied, breaking open a steaming biscuit. "Stayed at her inn." "She's a fine woman," said an older hand, nodding respectfully. "Been through a lot, but never complains." Garrett's curiosity stirred. What happened to her husband? The men exchanged glances before the older hand answered. "Typhoid took him, winter of '75. Left her with the inn and a mountain of debt. Everyone thought she'd sell and go back east to her family, but she's stubborn. Worked day and night to keep that place running." "Done a good job of it, too," added Thornton, who had joined them for the meal. "Inn's prospering now. She's even taken to hosting some of the spring visitors who come for the waters. Turned down plenty of suitors," the redhead chimed in with a grin, "including the banker's son and that fancy lawyer from San Francisco." "That's enough gossip," Thornton said firmly. "Mrs. Newcomb's business is her own. She sent us a good hand, and that's what matters." The conversation turned to ranch matters after that, but Garrett found himself thinking about Catherine's story. It took grit to face down debt and loneliness in a western town, especially for a woman alone. He respected that kind of determination. It mirrored his own survival instincts, though he'd never had to fight to keep a home, having never claimed one. The next morning began before dawn, with Garrett joining the other hands for a quick breakfast before heading out to the corrals. He spent the day working patiently with the Mustangs, using techniques he'd learned from a Nez Perce horseman years earlier. By sunset, he'd made progress with two of the more receptive animals, earning Thornton's approval. Days fell into a rhythm at the ranch: early mornings, physically demanding work, hearty meals, and exhausted sleep. Garrett found himself enjoying the temporary stability, the camaraderie of the bunkhouse, and the satisfaction of making headway with the wild horses. On Saturday evening, after a particularly successful day with the most challenging of the Mustangs, Thornton approached him as he was rubbing down his own mare. "Some of the boys are heading into town tonight," Thornton said. "Thought you might want to join them. You've earned a break." Garrett considered the invitation. He hadn't been back to Calistoga since taking the job, had deliberately kept his focus on the work at hand. But the thought of seeing Katherine again stirred something in him he couldn't quite name. "Might do that," he replied casually. "Thanks." An hour later, Garrett rode into town with three other ranch hands. They headed straight for the saloon, but Garrett begged off, saying he wanted to get a proper meal first. The men teased him good-naturedly before disappearing through the batwing doors, leaving Garrett alone on the main street. He stood for a moment, debating his next move. The logical choice would be to join the men for a drink, perhaps a game of cards. Instead, his feet carried him toward the Calistoga Inn, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. The dining room was busy with Saturday night patrons, but Katherine spotted him the moment he entered. She was helping an elderly couple to their table, but excused herself to approach him. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, genuine pleasure warming her voice. "I heard you took the job at Thornton's." "I did," he replied, suddenly conscious of his clean but work-worn appearance. "Thought I'd come into town for a real meal tonight." "Of course." She led him to a small table near the back. "How are you finding the work?" "Good. The Mustangs are coming along. Should have them saddle-ready within the fortnight." Katherine nodded approvingly. "Ben's pleased with your work. He mentioned it when he was in town yesterday." The idea that she and Thornton had discussed him stirred an unexpected warmth in Garrett's chest. "It's temporary," he said, feeling a strange need to remind her, and perhaps himself, of that fact. Still planning to head north after. Something flickered in her eyes: disappointment, perhaps, but she merely smiled. "Well, we're glad to have you while you're here. What can I bring you for supper?" After she took his order and left, Garrett found himself watching her move through the room, noting the easy way she had with the patrons, the quiet authority she commanded. She was a woman of substance, he thought, the kind who built things that lasted. Unlike himself. The meal was excellent roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh greens, followed by a slice of blackberry cobbler that rivaled the apple pie. Katherine checked on him periodically, exchanging brief pleasantries before attending to other guests. As the dining room began to empty, she returned with a pot of coffee. "May I join you?" she asked. "Unless you're planning to meet friends at the saloon." "No plans," he replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Company would be welcome." She sat, pouring coffee for them both. "How long do you think you'll stay in Calistoga?" Garrett considered the question. The job at Thornton's should last another week or so. After that, he shrugged. "The road calls." Katherine nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "You've been traveling a long time, haven't you?" 15 years, he admitted. "Since I was 20. "What started you wandering?" she asked, then quickly added, "If you don't mind my asking." Normally, Garrett would have deflected such a personal question. But there was something about Katherine's direct gaze that made evasion seem pointless. "War ended. Home was gone. Didn't see much reason to rebuild when I could just keep moving." "The war took much from many," she said softly. "My brother never came home from Gettysburg." "I'm sorry," Garrett said, meaning it. "Confederate." She shook her head. "Union. We're from Pennsylvania originally. But the loss is the same, no matter which side you fought for." It was a generous sentiment, one Garrett hadn't often encountered in his travels. "Yes, madam, it is." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the shared understanding of loss creating a bridge between them. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Katherine asked finally. "The traveling." Garrett had asked himself the same question more times than he cared to admit, especially on cold nights under strange skies. Sometimes, he conceded. But staying anywhere means building something. And building means you have something to lose. Katherine's eyes met his, a challenge in their green depths. Is that really such a terrible risk? Having something worth losing? Before he could answer, the front door of the inn burst open, and two of the ranch hands he'd ridden into town with stumbled in, clearly having enjoyed the saloon's offerings. "Sullivan," called the redhead, grinning widely. "There you are? Been looking all over. Come have a drink with us." Garrett grimaced apologetically at Katherine. "Seems my friends have found me." She rose gracefully, collecting their cups. "You should go. Men need companionship sometimes." "This conversation isn't finished," he said, surprising himself with his boldness. A smile touched her lips. "No, I don't believe it is. Good night, Garrett." He joined his rowdy companions, allowing himself to be led back to the saloon, though his thoughts remained with the widow and her challenging question. The next morning found Garrett nursing a mild headache as he worked with the Mustangs. The ranch hands had kept him out later than intended, insisting on celebrating his progress with the horses through multiple rounds of whiskey. He'd finally extricated himself well after midnight, walking back to the ranch rather than trusting his horsemanship in such a state. As he worked, he found his mind drifting to Katherine and their interrupted conversation. Having something worth losing. The very thought had kept him moving for 15 years, avoiding attachments that would inevitably lead to pain. Yet watching her manage her inn, building a life from the ashes of tragedy, made him wonder if he'd been running from the wrong things all along. The week passed quickly, with Garrett making significant progress with the Mustangs. Thornton was impressed enough to offer him an extension, another 2 weeks of work helping with the spring cattle drive. "Could use a man with your skills," the rancher said. "Pay would be the same, but there'd be a bonus at the end if all goes well." Garrett should have accepted immediately. It was good money, honest work, and would bolster his funds for the journey north. Instead, he found himself saying, "Let me think on it overnight." Thornton raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Fair enough. Let me know by morning." That evening, Garrett rode into Calistoga again, this time alone. The streets were quiet on a Wednesday night, most businesses already closed. The inn's dining room was nearly empty, just a traveling salesman finishing a late supper. Katherine looked up from the ledger she was reviewing at the counter, surprise and pleasure crossing her face. "Mr. Sullivan, I wasn't expecting to see you tonight." "Garrett," he reminded her, "and I was hoping I might get a meal, if it's not too late." "The kitchen's closed," she said apologetically, "but I could fix you something simple myself, if you're hungry." "That's kind, but I don't want to trouble you." She set aside the ledger. "It's no trouble. Come through to the kitchen." Garrett followed her through a door behind the counter, finding himself in a warm kitchen with a large cast iron stove, wooden work tables, and rows of copper pots hanging from hooks. It was spotlessly clean, everything in its place. "Sit," Katherine instructed, gesturing to a small table in the corner. "I can offer you cold chicken, bread, and cheese. And there's apple pie left from supper." "Sounds perfect," Garrett said, settling onto a wooden chair. "Thank you." She moved efficiently around the kitchen, assembling a plate for him and setting it on the table along with a glass of cider. Then, to his surprise, she took the seat opposite him. "You look like you have something on your mind," she observed. Garrett smiled wryly. "That obvious, is it?" "Only to someone who's been watching," she replied, then flushed slightly at the admission. He took a bite of chicken, gathering his thoughts. "Thornton offered me more work. Another 2 weeks, helping with the cattle drive." "That's good, isn't it? Ben doesn't make such offers lightly." "It is," Garrett agreed. "Good pay, good work." Katherine studied him. "But you're not sure you want to stay." "I'm not sure I know how to stay," he admitted, the truth emerging before he could guard it. "Been moving so long, it's become a habit. The only life I understand." She was quiet for a moment, her hands folded on the table. Habits can be broken, if there's sufficient reason. Their eyes met across the table, and Garrett felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of the growing connection that neither had named. "Katherine," he began, her first name feeling intimate on his tongue. "I'm not the kind of man who can offer stability or promises." "I'm not asking for promises," she said quietly. "Just honesty." "Honestly, then I find myself thinking about you when I should be focusing on work. I find myself riding into town on a Wednesday night when I should be resting for an early morning. I find myself—" He paused, searching for words, wondering what it might be like to stop running. Color rose in her cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. "And what answers have you found?" "None yet," he said with a rueful smile. "Except that I'm considering taking Thornton's offer, which is not something the Garrett Sullivan of 2 weeks ago would have done." A smile curved her lips. "Well, I think that's a step in an interesting direction, at least." They talked long into the evening, about small things and large, his experiences during his years of travel, her struggles keeping the inn after her husband's death, their shared memories of the world before the war changed everything. It was the longest conversation Garrett had engaged in for years, and he found himself opening up in ways that would have been unthinkable with anyone else. As midnight approached, Katherine stifled a yawn. "I should let you get back to the ranch. You have an early start tomorrow." "And a decision to make," Garrett added, rising from his chair. She stood as well, walking him to the front door of the inn. In the dimly lit entry hall, she turned to face him. "Whatever you decide, I've enjoyed our conversations, Garrett." "As have I," he said, suddenly acutely aware of her proximity, of the scent of lavender that clung to her hair, of the way the lamplight illuminated the fine bones of her face. Before he could overthink it, he leaned down and kissed her, a gentle brush of lips that nonetheless sent heat coursing through him. Katherine stilled for a moment, then leaned into the kiss, her hand coming to rest lightly on his chest. When they separated, her eyes were wide, her breathing slightly uneven. "That was unexpected," she whispered. "For both of us," Garrett agreed, his heart hammering in his chest. "But not unwelcome, I hope?" She shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "No, not unwelcome at all." He wanted nothing more than to kiss her again, to lose himself in the warmth of her response, but wisdom prevailed. "I should go," he said reluctantly. Katherine nodded, stepping back. "Will I see you again before you decide?" "Yes," he promised. "One way or another." The ride back to Thornton's ranch was a blur, Garrett's mind too full of Katherine Newcomb to notice the beauty of the star-filled night or the crisp spring air. He'd kissed her, an impulsive act so unlike his careful, measured approach to life that it should have alarmed him. Instead, he felt more alive than he had in years. But what did it mean? What could possibly come of an attraction between a drifter who never stayed anywhere and a woman who had built a life around permanence and community? The questions circled in his mind as he unsaddled his horse and made his way to the bunkhouse. Morning brought clarity, as it often did. Garrett rose before dawn, his decision made. He sought out Thornton as the rancher was saddling his horse for the day's work. "I'll take the job," Garrett said without preamble. The cattle drive, and whatever else you need for the next 2 weeks. Thornton studied him for a moment, then nodded. Glad to hear it. Something changed your mind. Garrett thought of Catherine's challenging question, of her soft lips beneath his. Found something worth considering, he said finally. The older man's eyes twinkled with understanding. Wouldn't happen to be a certain innkeeper, would it? Garrett didn't answer, but his expression must have been confirmation enough, for Thornton laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. Kate Newcomb is the finest woman in this county, he said, and the most stubborn. You've got your work cut out for you if you're setting your cap in that direction. I haven't decided anything beyond the next 2 weeks, Garrett protested. Thornton just smiled knowingly. If you say so, Sullivan. If you say so. The days that followed were busy ones. Preparing for the cattle drive consumed most of Garrett's waking hours, with the Mustang training continuing alongside the new responsibilities. He managed only one brief visit to town, stopping by the inn long enough to tell Katherine he'd taken Thornton's offer. The pleasure in her eyes at his news warmed him for days afterward, carrying him through the grueling work of the cattle drive. For 10 days, he and the other hands moved Thornton's herd to spring pastures higher in the hills, battling difficult terrain, unpredictable weather, and the constant challenge of keeping 500 head of cattle moving in the right direction. When they returned, exhausted but successful, Thornton made good on his promise of a bonus. Garrett found himself with more money than he'd had in years, enough to see him comfortably to Oregon and beyond, should he choose to continue his journey north. The question that had seemed so simple 2 weeks earlier now weighed heavily on him as he rode back to Calistoga on his final day of employment. The sun was setting as he approached the inn, painting the white clapboard building with golden light. Katherine was in the garden behind the inn, cutting flowers for the dining tables, when he arrived. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps, her face lighting with a smile that made his heart stutter. "You're back," she said, straightening with a bunch of spring blooms in her hand. "How was the drive?" "Successful," he replied, drinking in the sight of her. "Thornton's herd is settled in the high meadows for summer grazing. And your Mustangs?" "All gentled and ready for training. Thornton says he'll get good prices for them come fall." Katherine nodded, then asked the question that hung between them. "So what will you do now?" Garrett took a deep breath. "That depends. On whether there might be a reason for me to stay in Calistoga a while longer." Her eyes softened. "I think there might be." Garrett stepped closer, taking the flowers from her hands and setting them aside. "I've been running a long time, Katherine. Not sure I know how to stop. Perhaps you just need the right invitation," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Would you stay for supper before you leave, Garrett Sullivan?" It was such a simple question, but they both knew it meant so much more. Will you stay, not just for a meal, but for the possibility of something neither of us expected to find? Garrett looked into her eyes, seeing hope and warmth and a future he hadn't dared imagine. "Yes," he said finally, "I believe I would." And as he bent to kiss her again, there in the garden with the setting sun painting the world in gold, Garrett Sullivan realized that perhaps the greatest adventure wasn't the next town over the horizon, but the journey of letting someone into the carefully guarded places of his heart. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether he would find the courage to put down roots after 15 years of drifting. But tonight, he would have supper with Katherine Newcomb, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the road ahead didn't call to him nearly as strongly as the woman in his arms.